Hello, folks, and welcome to Train the Trainer session number 2. It's the sequel. No, after last week's Train the Trainer session, I guess actually it was September 22nd. We listened to your feedback, and we, as a committee, came back together and added certain changes to um, the presentation that we feel represents a little bit more of our goal of providing tools for our listeners and to provide better resources for the trainers. So we're going to go through, you'll see a lot of the information that we have here is very similar. However, you will notice the changes. Now we're creating what we feel is a little bit more of a story. We want to explain why a lot of the scientific elements are still there. However, we've also added more tools that people can use to be able to move forward with. We would love, especially in this format, there's the chat available, there's the Q&A. We'll go through some of the polls, why we've done some of the changes, and we'd like to hear further feedback. There are elements of this that you can certainly change for your training program. And specifically, we're doing some callbacks to some of the previous trainings we did, like specifically last year's kindness and communication. But overall, we feel this is a little bit of a tighter presentation. It does tell a story. We've changed a couple of the slides, one of the videos, things like that. So we look forward to walking you through and explaining why we did some of the changes, as well as what some of these changes are. For the next slide, I'm having a little bit of fun with this. Yas and I are going to be doing this jointly. So Yas, thank you very much for being here, and again accommodating what we normally don't do, which is a second Train the Trainer, but we look forward to providing you guys with as much feedback and letting you know, again, your comments are very important to us. So thank you very much. And I'm going to I did kind of notice that I'm using guys quite a bit, and I'm going to try and use folks instead. That's the suggestion. So thanks, folks, everybody, for being here, and let's get this started. So how you want to represent Conflict Resolution Day and its history. We're very proud that we've been around since 07 doing this, bringing in different, or is it 05? It's 05. The Conflict Resolution Day Planning Committee was formed in 07, and we've done these presentations since. What we're trying to do is just bring awareness and provide tools for regular people to be able to use. A lot of this stuff from your training as a mediator or in conflict management, you will have learned some of these tools and apply them daily. For a lot of the listeners, we don't think that they have, and so this is where it gets to be really interesting. This in particular is you need to have in your PowerPoint, if you're going to use this slide, you're going to need an add-in for your PowerPoint. It's called a web viewer, because this is an actual link. This is a live website, and we use that twice. We use it here, and we use it at another point where we start talking about the cognitive bias codex. So we encourage you to get that add in on your PowerPoint to be able to use live web pages as a link. This page is native-land.ca, as shown here in the bottom corner. And it's wonderful because it shows the complexity of the land acknowledgement and of our history. So as we go through, we can see all the treaties, we can see the languages, and we can see the territories that we're talking about. The land acknowledgement is I'd like to begin with that and say that I respectfully acknowledge that the land that I live and work on is Treaty 6 territory within the Métis homelands and Métis Nation of Alberta Region 4, on traditional and unceded territory of the many First Nations such as the Nehiyaw, Dene, Nakota, Isika, Anishinaabe, and Nitsapi. I would also like to acknowledge that this presentation may be seen across the treaties and lands from coast to coast to coast. Our goal here is to define and recognize bias, learn a little bit about the science behind bias, and see how it can be recognized in an environment. We will then are going to walk through learning strategies and communication tools to minimize the impact of bias. Before we go into the poll, and we're going to go into a poll right away, the purpose here is to recognize not only their bias and call them out on it, but it's how do we do that, and how do we recognize our own biases throughout this. So as a quick start, we wanted to start off and say with a poll. Are we going to do the poll right now? Yes.
Yepers. Let's see if it works.
All right.
You guys see it?
I see it. Are you biased? Yes, no, or maybe. What is your opinion? What do you think? Where do you think you are at? And I think that as we go through and we start seeing some of the respondents from the public, even if you just do this part as a show of hands, we might have a lot of different answers than what I'm seeing here, because I think there's a little bit more self-awareness from this group, because we have I'm going to end the poll here in 5 seconds. Let's say 5.
Can we let people know it is anonymous? We cannot see who has answered or what your answer is, just that we have 62%, 75%. Couple of other people, maybe not.
No, it's good enough. It's good enough. And so at the end of the poll, we're going to share the results now. Can you see the results?
Yeah.
Perfect. So what we have is we have 100% of people that participated say that they have a bias. Now, how do we articulate it? So I'll stop sharing now. There we go. Let me close that. Okay. So this is a really good start to where we're going, because now we want to be able to not only say, yes, we have a bias, but which bias is it? And this is where it gets important. So we're going to define bias, just so we're all working for the purpose of this presentation, we're all working from the same definition. So a bias is a tendency, inclination, or prejudice towards or against something or someone. Some biases are positive and helpful. For example, choosing to eat only foods that are considered healthy, or staying away from someone who's knowingly causing harm. But biases are also often based off stereotypes rather than the actual knowledge of an individual or a circumstance. Whether positive or negative, such cognitive shortcuts can result in prejudice or prejudgments that lead to rash decisions or even discriminatory practices. That's the definition that we're working. So let's start talking a little bit about the science behind and the environmental recognition of some of these biases. So what is a cognitive bias? A cognitive bias is the ways that we think about and perceive the world that do not necessarily reflect reality. Our mission here is not to prove to anybody, but just state every single one of us has some form of cognitive bias, regardless of our age, our gender, race, or level of education. It just makes sense. And we have dozens and dozens that have been recognized by researchers in recent history. And this page, again, this is one of those web links. And again, the source is here at the bottom. The source is in the notes of the PowerPoint. And as we go through, you can actually see that these are hyperlinks. So for example, if we want more explanation into what a confirmation bias is, we can click on this and we have a full explanation, and you can really go down the rabbit hole and start seeing where some of these biases are. So this codex is fantastic. I know that I've spent 1 or 2 nights, probably well past midnight, taking a look and going down this this rabbit hole. It's really, really cool. And it's broken down into 4 basic ideas: where our brains are, where we have, if we have too much information, how do we act? Where we have not enough meaning, how do we react? Need to act fast, or what should we remember? And it's pretty neat how it's all done. So really kudos to whoever put this together, because it's quite amazing. Then we go into the heuristics video, and heuristics is a really cool way of explaining the why we have a bias. We're not trying to attach blame nor judgment on anybody for any bias. We're trying to say we have bias. This is how we define them. This is how we can subgroup them. And then this is how we can deal with them. That's the point of us being able to work together like this. So what is heuristics? The definition that we're using for heuristics is an approach to problem solving or self-discovery that employs a practical method that is not necessarily perfect, but sufficient for reaching an immediate goal. Now that's really important, that differential, right? Because all heuristics does is it allows us to sort through tons and tons of information and get information in our memories and minds efficiently. And it also helps us to make those decisions efficiently. So here's the video, and we'll just show that again.
Every day you make decisions and judgments. Sometimes you're able to think about them carefully, but other times you make them on the fly using little information. This is where heuristics come in. Heuristics are straightforward rules of thumb that we develop based on our past experiences. They're cognitive tools that help us make quick decisions or judgments. Life would be exhausting if we had to deliberate over every one of the hundreds of choices we make every day. So instead, we use our heuristics as shortcuts to make judgments about the world around us. For example, rather than spending time deciding what to wear every day, you might have some default outfits. Or when faced with a lunch menu with too many options, you may opt for what you've enjoyed in the past. Heuristics aren't about making the perfect decision or judgment, just about making one quickly. Heuristics play a role in our reasoning about the broader world, too. As an example, consider the rate of violence in the world over the past century. Is the world more or less violent in the past 20 years than previously? Heuristic reasoning might lead us to think that the world is more violent today than it has been in the past. Every day, we're confronted with images of tragedy in the news and on social media. We might reasonably assume that the world is more violent today than ever before using what's called an availability heuristic. That is, examples of violence that are so readily available, we just naturally assume the world is more violent today. But in fact, the world is more peaceful today than ever before in human history. We may hear a lot about violent events, but in terms of raw numbers, fewer people die today at the hands of other human beings than ever before. So that heuristic about how violent the world is incorrect. In fact, a slew of other heuristics can easily lead us to mistaken conclusions. And it doesn't matter how smart or well-educated you are. Anyone can place too much trust in the mental shortcuts they use to make sense of the world. Take this example. Let's say a person tests positive for a rare disease, one that only 1 in 1,000 people have. What is the likelihood that he actually has the disease? Most of us would say the likelihood is very high based on the test results alone. But what if the results were inaccurate 10% of the time? If the false positive rate is 10%, a common number in medical tests, then it is highly unlikely our patient has the disease. In fact, based on the prevalence of the disease and the test result, we can be 99% sure he doesn't have the disease. This is because the odds of getting a false positive result, 1 in 10, are much higher than the odds of actually having the disease, 1 in 1,000. But in multiple studies, physicians routinely get this wrong, overestimating the likelihood that their patient actually has the disease. Psychologists call this the representativeness heuristic. People assume an individual case is more representative than it actually is. Our political views can especially suffer from an over-reliance on heuristics. Just consider how we deal with political issues. We'll often let our political identities and our heuristics about how right we think they are stand in lieu of important details and information we need to have an informed view. Because our heuristics can so easily lead us to faulty conclusions, it's important to be humble about our views. In light of our fallibility, we have to do something that doesn't come easy. We must recognize that the world is an uncertain place and that our judgments about it are often wrong. We ought to listen to opinions we may initially consider wrong or even offensive. Our intuitions are useful, even necessary when it comes to making quick judgments about the world, but that doesn't mean they're correct. Recognizing the flawed nature of your thinking is a bold first step to challenge
There's going to be a lot of callbacks to this video throughout the presentation. there's a lot of great information there. And at the end, it says, well, we need to do this. We need to listen more. We need to question where we get our information from. What we're trying to do is build a story in here that allows us the availability to do that, and then the acceptance to do that. I think that sometimes we don't give ourselves the acceptance to say that we're wrong. And there's a lot of psychology that goes behind that. We want to do a little bit of a special focus on availability heuristic, because and I just wish there was some example of something happened globally in the last 3 years that that I could think of, but we as a committee just couldn't think of any single thing that happened globally in the last 3 years. So we're going to use this. If you watch Shark Week and you suddenly see, that shark attacks are up at the beaches, even when you go to the beach, you're going to be more aware or more fearful of sharks. That's called the availability heuristic. And I go to a freshwater lake beach just outside of Banff, and I'm still afraid of sharks after seeing this. So it doesn't really make sense, but it's how we're influenced by recent memories. And if you take a look, and it's emotionally charged many of the times, right? A shark attack can lead to death, right? So that's why it's so emotionally, we get attached to it. And recently in Canada, we saw marketers take advantage of that with the Lisa Laflamme controversy with CTV, with Dove coming out with the Keep the Gray campaign. And a lot of people joined in on that. It was very emotionally charged, right? Based off what they knew to be one story that was very, very famous. So it's how marketers can also kind of lead us that way. Another way that marketers can lead us down a certain path is the anchoring effect. So if I'm walking down the mall and I see a coffee mug for $1,000, I'm like, oh my God, that is absolutely insane. I'm never spending $1,000 on a coffee mug. And hopefully most of the listeners here would agree. However, if I take the corner and I see the exact same coffee mug on for only $300, I'm now thinking I have an opportunity to save $700 instead of still spending $300 on a coffee mug. So that's an extreme example, but think about times in your life where you were influenced by the anchoring effect. For example, how many times have you bought a product with a 1-star review when there was another product right beside with a 5-star review? That's an anchoring effect. Okay, so they're thought to be somewhat arbitrary and subjective, but they're based also on how we feel about the topic. So decision-making is supported by this. We move on to cognitive dissonance. This is one of my favorite cartoons that we found for this presentation, and of course we have the heart running towards reality, but no, just let's move towards anything else. So this is how we deal with and then reject reality or even contradictory ideas. So it's a type of bias where discomfort is caused by holding conflicting elements of knowledge. So what we do is we usually just devalue and discard a conflicting piece of knowledge, whether it be science, whether it be reality. And again, I just wish there was some example over the last 3 years that we could come to where it might have been polarizing somewhat. But think of a time when you outright rejected a piece of information based on your first gut reaction to it. And I think this is a good opportunity, if you're doing this presentation in person, to start talking to the audience. Think about a time, did you reject outright a piece of information? The example that we're going to be using is the one of Galileo. Galileo found out through his research that in fact, and at the time that he did his research, there was a religious power, political power in place. And he discovered that the Earth actually is not the center of the universe, and it actually revolves around the sun. That information conflicted with the ideas of the time, and he was forced into prison and forced to recant. So again, we also, so that's one aspect. Another aspect is, sometimes we just devalue something because of the source. So a lot of people might have opinions, for example, on CBC. If it comes from the CBC, it's colored. Or if it comes from the CBC, it's the stone cold truth. So there's different ways of looking at the same source of information depending on where it came from. The confirmation bias is, again, this is a cartoon that I really love, right? We take a look at all the facts and evidence and we just discard the ones that don't match up with our personal beliefs. So it's the tendency to search for, interpret, focus on, and remember information in a way that confirms our own prejudices and preconceptions. Now, from this, we have a couple of sort of subsidiary sort of ideas when it comes to confirmation bias. The first one is the backfire effect. So the backfire effect is when you show somebody evidence or proof, they still double down on their preconception. I think a very famous case of that happened in the United States with the birther movement regarding Barack Obama's country of birth. And there was a lot of people that thought he was born in Kenya. And so when he actually showed his birth certificate and it was shown that he was born in the United States, people said, oh, that's proof that he was actually born in Kenya. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but you can see how the backfire effect can, and it has worked. And that's a perfect example. We also have the expectation bias. The expectation bias is really cool because you can see it especially in conversations that you have with people. Now, this is, the examples that we use are more from the researcher perspective, but you can also see how it is affected in common day-to-day language, or conversations. So it is the tendency for somebody to believe, certify, and even publish data that agrees with their expectations of the outcome. If I believe something is going to work, or if I believe something to be false, I'm going to take a look at data that supports my view, and only the data that supports my view. And then we disbelieve, discard, or even downgrade those that corresponding evidence that conflicts with those ideas. So you can see how we use that. And again, the reason we're doing this is that when we're in a conversation or a debate or an argument or a conflict, we can recognize these biases that we're bringing to the table. It's not really to educate the other person, but if we recognize that in them, we can now apply something else. And we'll get to what that thing is. But for a lot of people that know me, this is something, if I could have something tattooed on my chest, this would be it. The egocentric bias. Now, the egocentric bias, this really points to where we want to take this conversation. This egocentric bias is defined simply through a lack of empathy. I think is a great way to say that. So for example, if I'm really good at math and you're not good at math, the egocentric bias would make me believe you're just not smart. But I have now not taken a look at all the things that you could be good at that I'm not, like social studies or language arts or the arts. Right? So it's a cognitive bias that causes people to rely too heavily on their own point of view when they examine events. So there's, it's the lack of recognition that we all have special talents. It leads us to believe that others hold the same preferences and values that we do. And it also is a bias that causes us to evaluate the fairness of a situation only in favor of ourselves, or as it relates to ourselves. So when this is a really good callback to last year's training, which we did, which was the kindness in communication. Because if we have empathy, the egocentric bias should never come into play, because we would recognize, maybe I recognize a time when doing anything and I wasn't as strong in that subject. How did I feel? Instead of, oh, you're not good at math, therefore you're not smart. Because that's not the case. And then we can go into something that a lot of these things